We shall be comparing colonial and post-colonial education in Sudan and Hong Kong over the time period 1945 to 2014 in relation to world culture theory. We shall also be looking at the idea of empire as the first form of globalisation.
But what is world culture theory? World culture theory views globalisation as a convergence of cultural ideas. These values include respect for individuals' rights, democracy, rational decision-making and autonomy. These are often thought of as coming from Western cultural values. But this view of globalisation finds that as globalisation spreads, these views become less culturally specific and are seen more as a universal set of principles that are beneficial to a society's development and prosperity. These rights are embodied by international organisations whose membership is made up of several countries, making the member states stronger as there is consensus in policy and trade agreements. World culture theory argues that these kinds of rights and organisations come about because of cultural shifts causing countries to have similar views. World culture theory states that education is very important as it is the main way that world culture is transmitted. The spread of schooling worldwide has also been linked to the spread of globalisation, as different education and aid agencies have been going to different countries to help schools and families. It is also based on the notion that one of the universal principles that all individuals have a right to education, so they can acquire skills and knowledge in order to benefit themselves and their community. Empires can be seen as the predecessor to globalisation as we know it now, and they are perhaps institutions that world culture theory could be applied to, as the empires attempted to influence other nations' cultures with that of their own by adding their own basic national values. The British Empire tried to make their culture dominant in the colonies that they owned, and, as the largest empire in the globe, it was able to spread its culture to great lengths. Being a maritime empire, Britain was able to exert its influence through trade, and it acquired territories diplomatically or through the use of force.
The history of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a colony established in 1842 after the First Opium War and is located on Hong Kong Island just off the Chinese mainland. From 1842 to 1945, the colony grew as a focal trading port in the Oriental theatre for the British Empire. Due to wars with the Japanese and the Chinese Revolution of 1912, the colony saw a rapid expansion in its population as refugees and skilled workers moved to Hong Kong to escape. This again happened after the Second World War, when skilled workers fled the Chinese communist takeover and sought refuge under British rule, leading to the economy growing further as a result. Its education for non-Westerners provided by the government was poor, with most education provided by Christian missionaries. Due to the laissez-faire attitude to the colony's economy, the social reforms were slow. However, this changed with the 25th Governor, Sir Murray McLehose. Under his premiership, many policies were implemented that benefited all those who lived in Hong Kong. For education, this was important, as he implemented a policy that required 9 years of compulsory education. He also established an assessment to increase the amount of subsidised places in senior secondary education. In 1992, Hong Kong was ranked 11th in the world for its economy, which allows them to invest heavily in their education system so that all students are provided with a high degree of education to maintain their status. Education is also important to many families in Hong Kong, and thus many students are pushed onto further education, with 55% attaining degree places in 1995. Which was an increase of 30% from 1992. Due to its successful education system, many of its high-level graduates immigrate. This has led to problems in its economy as its skilled workers were leaving, which led to the government in the 1990s attempting to increase its higher education intake. The economy in 2015 Hong Kong is still booming, which allows them to invest 18% of their government expenditure into education, which is the equivalent of $79.3 billion. The model pre-handover in 1987 followed the British schooling system. But now it's under the influence of China, they've adopted a more Asian American system of schooling. Since the turn of the millennium, they have shortened years spent in high school to 3 and increased the university study period by 1 year to 4 years. Thus, the evidence for the change of practice can be seen clearly.
The Sudan was annexed in 1897 after a British expedition led by Lord Kitchener. Its northern segment was treated as part of Egypt, which led to its further Islamisation, while the south had English introduced as its primary language and the influence of Arab and Muslim culture was limited by the British. This was done in order to integrate South Sudan into British East Africa. The north of Sudan had increased funding and investment in its industries and educational systems, as evidenced by the opening of Khartoum University in order to create skilled workers. Post-independence in 1956, the Sudan went through 2 civil wars with the southern parts of its country. Causes of these civil wars were deeply rooted in the efforts of the colonial British to influence the culture in the south, to bring it in line with their former colonies. Thus, the country has been in a near constant state of turmoil since independence, and therefore development of its economy and education system has stagnated severely. At independence, the education budget stood at 15.5% of the total government expenditure in the entire Sudan, which supported 1,178 primary schools, 108 intermediate schools, and 49 government secondary schools, as well as one university situated in Khartoum. However, around 1,000 pupils were sent abroad to study. Overall, the Sudanese government supported 228,743 students across all ages. Education beyond the primary stage followed the traditional British model and also had pupils learning in Arabic and English. By 1991, General Bashar, the nominal leader of Sudan, wanted Arabic to replace English across the education system and also double the amount of university applicants. Since the independence of South Sudan in 2011, education has been seen as a top priority amongst many in both countries, yet the lack of teaching facilities and equipment has caused many children to not complete their entire education. Adult literacy is also estimated to be around 27% in the south, in comparison to the North Sudan, where adult literacy is at 60%. The northern government's inability to control the south is partly why the educational infrastructure in the south has suffered, as it has less funding and organisation.
How they conform with world culture theory. Both South Sudan and Hong Kong were being steered towards a more British culture, and this can be seen through English being taught in most schools. Christianity is also an influential reminder of the empire in both South Sudan and Hong Kong. Another similarity between Hong Kong, the Sudan as a whole, and world culture theory is that all the nations place a high emphasis on education and attainment. The evidence for this is that both nations invest a large share of their budget into education. As according to world culture theory, education helps spread world cultural values such as the idea of human rights. World culture theory can also be seen in the idea of self-determination and autonomy, with an example for this being the recent independence of South Sudan and its autonomous state before that, and also the near-autonomous state of Hong Kong within China. Further to world culture theory, Hong Kong and the Sudans both belong to different international organisations, such as the World Trade Organization and the United Nations. World culture theory states that through joining these organisations, it strengthens the nation state, as they can work together with others to achieve their goals for their development. The empire spread cultural values across the world, and in this case the values of self-determination can be seen in Sudan with its independence referendum and in Hong Kong with its autonomy from the head of the empire. Empire spread education across the globe, which is a key aim of world culture theory, although this may not happen at the same rate in all countries. All three countries use forms of international education infrastructure, with Hong Kong subscribing to an Asian American approach and the Sudan still using a British system of education.
How these countries diverge from world culture theory. In a clash with world culture theory, Hong Kong is being stripped of its self-determination and autonomy despite being part of an international organisation. Currently, the Chinese government has been eroding the rights of the Hong Kong Autonomous Zone, even though these rights were guaranteed back in 1997. If such autonomy is lost, China could reduce the education funding in Hong Kong to bring it to a similar level to their own spending, and thus reduce the education quality. Although the Sudan is part of many international organisations, it has been in conflict with its neighbours and has also suffered internal struggles. Thus, it deviates from world culture theory idea that nation-states become stronger and more united when part of international organisations. These conflicts have caused the infrastructure and education provision to become increasingly weak. Though international organisations are meant to develop cooperation between nations, this has not been the case for the Sudan. The same goes for the South, although a civil war over disputed leadership has led to economic and educational infrastructure being severely weakened, more so than in the North. Empire itself is an early form of globalisation, and, in line with world culture theory, it eventually saw self-determination and education throughout the world. However, its aims were not so noble at first, and education in some places, such as South Sudan, did not see as much investment and development as its neighbours or other countries in the empire, such as Hong Kong and North Sudan. Also, due to the nature of world culture theory taking a long time to establish itself, places like South Sudan currently maintain more elements of their own culture rather than embracing the liberal values of international organisations, which has led to a detrimental effect on their education due to conflicts arising over different beliefs and the traditional view that women shouldn't be educated.
Conclusion. In comparing educational development of the nations within the context of world culture theory and empire, as the first form of globalisation, we can see that since 1945, their educational systems have diverged massively compared to when they were all under British rule. The Sudan may have suffered due to the cultural boundaries the British created in the north and south, and also from their departure as a colonial territory in 1956. It could be argued that continued membership of the empire, and furthermore the international community, could have led to less conflict and sustained growth of its economy and the development of its education system. In contrast, Hong Kong's continued status as a crown dependency, and in accordance with world culture theory, led to the colony exerting their own form of self-determination. and due to its status as a world trading hub, was able to invest in its education. Its continued association with Britain also led to the melding of the Chinese and British cultures. Continued membership also strengthened the city-state, and therefore education system in accordance with world culture theory. Thus it could be argued that the empire, as an agent of globalisation, brought educational advantages to those who were part of it. However, there were other aspects of the empire which were detrimental to a country's sustained growth in the short term.